What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and honestly, I was supposed to wait until next week to cover this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go ahead and cover it now because the God of Hammers is just so good. What it looks like is there will be like an epilogue to this, so we'll cover that epilogue once it's released, assuming it hasn't come out already. I'll have to double check and make sure. But picking up off the last video that we did, this is now Thor with the full totality of the Odin Force. Now, here's one thing that I want to specify here, and it's one of the things that Donny Cates has established here, that the Odin Force in its full totality, its completion, cannot be fully handed over to Thor until Odin has completely passed on, which means that there's only ever been one time when Thor had this level of the Odin Force, and that was when he was Rune King Thor. That seems to be the only time, or at least there were a couple things that added as a caveat to that, like powered by the Norn stones and so on and so forth, but Thor's ridiculously overpowered here, right? It's the most powerful version of Thor that we've seen, with the exception of Rune King Thor and presumably when he had the power cosmic, although we're not entirely sure. I don't think Marvel's ever really scaled the power cosmic versus the Odin Force, although I think it just stands to reason through common sense, at least for those of us who have read comics, that the Odin Force is not nearly as powerful as the power cosmic, right? So you just kind of roll with that and accept it. But ultimately what ends up happening is that in this conflict, Thor actually ends up summoning Hofun from Sif, right? Hofun basically being the sword of Heimdall that has now been passed to Sif following Heimdall's death. And so the cool thing about this is that with him having that and using the Odin Force, one of the things that Sif says is you can't be reckless with this power. This power you have, you can't just use it willy-nilly. This is not like years gone by where you basically have, you can just face off against a threat seemingly forever. If you exhaust too much of the Odin Force, you'll fall into the Odin sleep. Even if that happens in the middle of a battle, right? You could literally be fighting this person and then just pass out. And if that happens, they'll destroy you because I can't keep you protected from this storm. It's just way too powerful. But the response of Thor is, I don't care, give me your sword. And in turn, the sword is handed to Thor, who uses it to open the Bifrost and then teleport the sentience of the hammer, the storm, directly to the forge where Mjolnir was made. And it's cool because he snatches the hammer back from it, and it's just like, do you recognize this place? Like, do you know this place? And initially, the storm is kind of like not right off the bat, and Thor's like, this is a forge, right? This is where you were born, Mjolnir, and this is where you will be destroyed. This is where you will be ended. And so what ends up happening here, and this is a crazy thing, Thor quite literally reignites the forge. And in doing so, right, it's like the heat of a billion suns, which is enough to seemingly overpower the storm itself. And then in doing so, when it initially tries to take the hammer back and use it again, Thor takes the hammer back a second time. And at that point, Thor starts smashing the hammer on the forge. Now, this is absolutely insane, because one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to the Thor mythos, a situation where he quite readily starts destroying his own hammer, that's not something that you would normally see. And in fact, Thor prizes the hammer above all else, and his use of the hammer is only a relatively recent thing in the lifespan of Thor. For those of you guys who never read Jason Aaron's run, one of the things that was established in Thor God of Thunder is that for years he was never able to lift Mjolnir. The enchantment was put on the hammer, and the hammer was basically left there by Odin, so that when Thor was ready, he could pick it up and he could wield it. But for quite some time in his life, he wasn't really able to. He was never really able to wield the hammer. The only thing that he really had at his disposal was Jarnbjorn, which is why if you go and you read Rick Remender's Uncanny Avengers, there's a point where he fights Apocalypse in the past, but he can't use his own hammer. He ends up having to use a battle axe that's magically enchanted to destroy celestial armor, and that's how, one, Jarnbjorn becomes as powerful as it is, and two, how it is that he's able to overpower Apocalypse. And so this hammer is a core part of Thor's life, right? It's as much a part of his own body as his beating heart. And so destroying it is not something that he readily does. But in going through and ripping this hammer apart, obliterating this hammer, what it seems to do is destroy the essence of the storm. Now, this is where things get a little murky, and this is something that may very well be addressed in the epilogue if it's ever addressed by Donny Cates at all. Although knowing Donny Cates, there's a couple conclusions we can draw here. The first is that the storm existed outside of the hammer, right? That it was literally encased inside the hammer at some point in time by Odin. And so destroying the hammer doesn't seem like it would be enough to destroy the storm. The storm would just dissipate and go back out into the universe and then continue its quest of death and destruction. The other conclusion that we can draw from this is the fact that because the storm had been imbued to the hammer for so long, that it is part and parcel to the hammer. So if the hammer is destroyed, the storm dies with it. It could also be that simply just the power of the sun just melts this thing. And that's kind of been a cornerstone of the Thor mythos really since Jason Aaron's run, that the power of the sun is so extreme that if someone is encased in it, they could basically be obliterated by it. I mean, quite literally, that's what happened with Mangog, that Mangog's physical form was destroyed in the sun and that its spiritual essence lived on, hence the reason why it bonded itself to the hammer, right? Why it bonded itself to the storm. But it's kind of a crazy thing because even when you look at that, like, a star is not really powerful enough to destroy a being of sufficient power, right? It's like throwing a beach ball at Thanos. This really wouldn't make any sense, right? And so it really can kind of go either way, which is why I say, I don't think we've heard the last of this. I don't think we've seen the last of this storm or any of this stuff. But what we do end up getting is that in the aftermath of this, because it required the totality of the Odin force to destroy this hammer, Thor ultimately passes out. And then when he wakes up, 4 months have passed. Now again, that's the nature of the Odin sleep, that the Odin sleep kind of changes depending on who's writing the story. So there are times when the Odin sleep has lasted almost a year, and there are times when it's lasted like a month. But in effect, all this is just Thor recharging. That's really all it is. It's him recharging the power of the Odin force, because remember, it's part and parcel to him now. Thor is in possession of the totality of the Odin force. That seems to be the case. And so as he begins to wake up, one of the things that he says is that he feels like he heard the voice of Odin while he was in the Odin sleep, and then ultimately ends up, waking up and realizing that Angela's there and Freya's there and Loki's there, right? Angela being the sister of Thor, right? From the realm of heaven. But nonetheless, it's kind of a funny thing because what he's told there is that in the time that he's been gone, a funeral has not been held for Odin. And the reason why is because Thor should be the one to lead that funeral. So it's very ceremonial. And honestly, it's very, very appropriate. But at the end of the day, Angela's like, we'll hold a ceremony, right? But there's no rush. There was nothing to bury, right? There's no body or anything like that. Like Odin is totally gone, right? His essence has been dispersed. You are now in possession of the Odin force, and that's basically it. And so in turn, they're all, you have like Loki and you have Freya, and it's kind of like, I mean, look, you need to rest. You need to let your energies recover. And the response of Angela is, he doesn't need any of that. Like, we all know what he needs, right? He does not need to rest. He doesn't need any grape juice, right? He doesn't need prune juice. He doesn't need the Golden Girls. What Thor needs is exactly what we've done for him. And so ultimately she says, get dressed, meet me in the armory. And so what ends up happening is once Thor gets there, it's this really, really amazing moment. When Thor gets to the armory, he finds the hammer has been restored, and it was restored by the angels of heaven. Now, I want to offer a bit of an explanation here. A lot of you guys who have been reading Thor for a long time, you guys know, or at least already know this, but for the people who are new here, I want to make sense of like the realm of heaven and Angela and all that stuff, right? So the idea here is that the character of Angela was originally part of the Spawn mythos out in Image Comics for the longest time. But what ended up happening is through a series of rights ownerships and all kinds of stuff, the character of Angela ended up coming over to Marvel because the guy who created her came over to Marvel. And so that basically meant that all the things he created came with him, because when it comes to like independent creators, their own creations are their own product. They belong directly to them and not anybody else, which is one of the reasons why you see a lot of major comic book creators write indie comics, because they maintain total ownership. But the way that Marvel played this out is they said that Angela was actually from a realm called Heaven, and it was the 10th realm instead of it being the 9 realms. But due to a conflict that had been held at a previous point in time, and what was basically a kind of armistice, so to speak, not really even a treaty, just essentially a ceasefire, that the 10th realm was cut off from the 9 realms, and it was allowed to just kind of live out there and do its own thing. But all that was covered in original sin. And so when this revelation came to pass, you ended up learning there was this great big huge realm out there, right? And it was called Heaven, and it had all these angels and all these people in it that nobody knew about, and that Angela is actually the sister of Thor. And so that's what Angela's talking about when she says, like, the angels of heaven were able to reassemble this thing. It's not perfect, it's not to its original state, but we did what we could. And so there's this really amazing moment, because remember, Thor and Angela haven't always seen eye to eye, and there's always been a bit of a conflict there between the two of them. But this is a massively respectful thing that Angela and the angels of heaven had done here, something they didn't even really have to do, because they don't view Odin the same way that they view Thor, right? They see Thor as somebody entirely different, and in a lot of ways, far more honorable than Odin was. And that's why Angela says, like, I told you I would clean up your mess if I had to, regardless of what that mess happened to be. So consider it cleaned up. And initially he's like, I know it's just a hammer. Like, I know that's it. Like, it doesn't have the power that it had before. It's not Mjolnir as it's always been, which is a very important thing, right? It's not Mjolnir the way that it's been before, which means that Thor could use this, and in some situations it would be stronger, whereas in other situations it could be weaker where it would have been stronger. So things aren't necessarily the same. It's really a way for Marvel to kind of rework the nature of the hammer and under what conditions are the most conducive to use it. And so what ends up happening here is Thor's like, I know there's no power here, but at the end of the day, you know, I'm okay with that. And that's when Angela says, well, I mean, maybe, but honestly, I think it just depends on who wields it. Don't you? And so ultimately Thor, you know, where he turns around, Angela's gone. And he's like, okay. And then he actually prays to Odin and he says, Father, I know somewhere you can hear my prayer. I am just so lost. I can't see the path that you've laid out before me. And then he hears this voice that says, keep your eyes open, boy. And then it goes to the hammer and it says, a king cannot rule from his knees. And so in essence, what it looks like here, and I could be wrong, we won't know until we get to the epilogue, but what it looks like here is the spirit of Odin, if you can call it that, Odin without the Odin force, I don't really know what that is, but the spirit of Odin is now encased inside the hammer. Whether that's true, I don't know. But if that is the case, this is a wholly different situation now, and no idea where in the world this even goes. I have no clue. But having said that, I absolutely love this. God, this was a ridiculously good Thor story. I love it when like writers come along and shift things up, change things around. It keeps it from growing stale, right? It keeps it from getting boring, right? Because after a while, it's like, well, here comes Thor with Mjolnir, whatever. But like, I love that this is being changed up. I find it absolutely awesome and refreshing. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. We'll probably make a full story out of this. Don't worry. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.